Video games have been around for decades, and many topics of controversy have arisen around this highly evolving field. One such is the effects that video games have on the social and behavioral actions of an individual. Many examples of video games that can affect social and behavioral actions have been created, but a few stand out above the rest. One of these being Custer's Revenge. Made in 1982, this 2-bit game had you fight your way through a battlefield, at the end of which you ran into an Indian tied to a pole. This then led to the simulated sexual assault of that Indian. Next, Mortal Kombat, made in 1993, can be looked at for its overtly violent fighting and death animations. These actions drove two companies, Sega and Nintendo, to fight over how these actions would be censored so that they wouldn't affect the mental and behavioral health of the buyer. Finally, we can look at Grand Theft Auto. First established in 1997, these games revolve around committing crimes and extremely violent acts, which can lead to some extreme mental and behavioral repercussions.
Well, one thing that we definitely know is that general video game usage does seem to be linked with a few different kinds of negative outcomes. I think the story is kind of more complex when we look at things like the content of the video games and also the context, playing it alone versus with others and doing it more socially. So we can talk about that. Okay. But broadly, video game playing and also screen time in general, which could include video game playing, seems to be linked with not so great academic outcomes, sometimes lower GPA. There are effects around sort of different kinds of emotional components, maybe showing greater aggression, maybe being less well versed in other kinds of sort of emotional regulation. I do think it's influential for adults. It just may be that children are particularly vulnerable and sensitive to some of the effects, certainly through channels of observational learning and the fact that different things are being modeled in video games, that they may not have all the sort of cognitive development to really take in and think about critically. And we do know that from other research, even going decades back, you may have heard of the Bobo doll experiment, where when children saw adults beating this like blown up clown doll, children would mimic the exact same behaviors and use the same expletives that the adults were, just by seeing it done. And so that hypothesis would hold for what happens with video game playing too. So I think the research is now moving more into, especially because various kinds of technology uses are they've rapidly taken off. It's very hard to avoid children engaging with screen time, and that can include apps and video games. And not all video games are violent. There's plenty of educational video games. So they might have drastically different sorts of consequences, and they're designed even to be sort of pro-social and educational in their outcomes. So some research has started to look at both the content and the context of those effects, which I mentioned earlier. So it seems to be both matters. So for example, certainly violent video game playing seems to have more negative consequences than other kinds of neutral content, or maybe even pro-social kind of cooperative content. But it doesn't stop there, because the context matters too. And some research has shown that it's the same violent video game, but if you play it alone versus with someone else, that could definitely have some different effects. And also, you could be doing the violent video game in some different ways. Like if the object was to be sort of cooperative, like maybe you are protecting a friend versus just simply annihilating people, that also seems to have sort of, at least it buffers from more of the negative effects. I'm not sure if it's outright positive, but it doesn't seem to be as negative. So there actually are some more good socialization effects, I think, when there is video game playing, either with another person or when the context and content are somewhat more positive. There is some research to suggest kind of like a twofold set of outcomes. Like on the one hand, it may be the kids as well as adults who are more social anyway that might engage in those more social video games or the social media sites. And so it's kind of the rich get richer, you know, they'll continue to do well. It kind of models and mimics their social relationships anyway. But on the other hand, there might be another group of kids as well as adults who are turning to those sorts of venues, you know, maybe the virtual life or other social media sites, because that's lacking in their actual sort of in-person interactions. And I think in those cases, that's where we see some of the damage, that really we can't replace those real life, those in-person interactions and their benefits through simply those virtual media. Yeah, I don't know enough about maybe what the research says, but part of what I would expect would be maybe the kind of the overall level of exposure to the, like if this was all that you were doing kind of day in, day out, and it was coming at a cost to, say, doing homework, you know, and I guess we could think for adults too, if this turned into more addictive behavior where it was getting in the way of daily functioning, say their work lives, or impacting their important key relationships, I think that's when we would definitely see some drop off of any potential positive effects. But like many other things in life, it's probably one of those things where in moderation, it can certainly be positive and at least not negative. And I think particularly if you kind of look at what the content is and what the context is as well.
Okay.
I mean, I suppose it certainly could. I mean, if we really see that many more people are engaging with those sorts of games. I also think that, you know, there could be arguments about particular people, particular children might be more susceptible to those effects. They also might be more likely to be the ones to play those video games. I don't think sort of every sector of the population is equally likely to play those games. I think at the very least there are gender effects. You know, boys and men may be more likely to engage in certain kinds of video games. So, and you know, there's other research, of course, around, you know, aggression, physical aggression being somewhat more likely among men compared to women, but that doesn't mean women aren't aggressive. It just happens sort of in other ways. They tend to be more relationally aggressive than do men. So I think there are some interaction effects of, you know, various sorts of other influences, maybe even ones that are more innate or biological, kind of interacting with this potent environmental effect of playing these very often graphic video games. Well, I think some of the broad things that we've already touched on would be my take-home points, like that it may not just be video games, but sort of screen time broadly could be particularly difficult and maybe linked with some negative outcomes when we look at really young kids. And I think parents would be wise to really think about how to introduce screen time, including video game playing as kids get older, and really look at the content and think about maybe even engaging in those games together. And I think that other theme of kind of like everything in moderation, I don't think we should totally assume that all video games are bad or have negative effects, and it would be really interesting to pinpoint like exactly when and in what ways I think video games could be positive.
It's apparent that video games have been and always will be a popular source of entertainment among a vast range of people. The effects that different types of video games have on someone are widely debated due to a multitude of factors. The different kinds of games can be as simple as an app on a smartphone or as advanced and realistic seeming as Grand Theft Auto. Depending on the content and the objective of the game, some effects could be beneficial, whereas some harmful. Similar effects that some researchers associate with those of video games can clearly be exhibited by someone with no video game experience too. As expressed in the interview with Dr. Rachel Farr, even professionals have a hard time pinpointing the direct relation between positive or negative social and emotional outcomes from video games, but that they can in fact cause behavioral differences in an individual.